Say we take off, nuke the site from orbit. There's only way to be sure.
Warning, the audio you are about to hear is best played at maximum volume when you and your partner are making love. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Gorilla Roundtable.
That's got to be the best beginning. Folks, welcome to Gorilla Roundtable, a panel-formatted discussion touching geopolitics, pop culture, and everything in between. I am Mike, a veteran MBA and free market capitalist, here with Nick, a PhD, tattoo canvas, and gin enthusiast, as well as Paul, a neuroscience graduate student.
Go look up Gorilla Roundtable on Twitter. Start tweeting at us, reading the kind of insane Twitters that we're sending out into the Twitter sphere. We call it the Twitter sphere, right?
Or the Twitterverse.
World of Twitter, the Twitterverse.
Yeah. I just have to say that anybody listening to this, getting on Twitter and tweeting to this show is probably the best decision you can make.
Yes.
Bar none.
And it costs you nothing.
Yeah, it's free.
Because the opportunity costs of your time are so low.
The best things in life are free.
Exactly. And Gorilla Roundtable is the best way to waste all of your free time.
Tell me about it. So, guys, have you been following this deal with Gambia and this coup that occurred in the beginning of 2015? It was like a blip on the radar. I don't even know if people followed it.
I did not follow it. Tell me what's going on.
Let's ask you this, Paul. Did you even hear about it?
I did not.
All right, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about it here. At the start of 2015, 20 people on a budget of $220K followed through on a plan to kill Yahya Jammeh, and I probably said his name. I just butchered it. He was the president of Gambia, right? The coup failed when 160 Gambian army soldiers never showed up to support the coup. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Gambia. It's a small country. It's got about 3,000 people in its armed forces. Geographically, it basically tracks the River Gambia inside Senegal. So I'm crazy about this, though, because one of the guys who bankrolled this coup was a U.S. citizen who was living in Austin, Texas, who was of Gambian descent.
Oh.
So
I kind of thought that's why you would bring this up. I noticed that when I came across this story.
But what I find so trippy is they spent $220,000 and they basically took a took a run at overthrowing a government, and that's just phenomenal to me because I'm like, well, what if they had, $500,000 or $1 million or $2 million? Like, I feel like you could have got it over the finish line if we'd have just, if these folks would have just spent the money.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta say, I'm a little impressed, because from the accounts that I've read, it didn't actually go that wrong. I mean, they actually were pretty close, and this thing could have worked. Not even $250,000. I mean,
like, that's a deal, right? Like, I didn't even think that's something I could do with my money.
I'm just saying, if beforehand you had asked me, what would it cost? I definitely would have said at least $500,000. I mean, just totally guessing.
Personally, in my savings account, I have $38,000 saved up for a coup, but that's just me.
Where are you looking?
Where are you looking?
Those penguins are really they're large and they're in charge, and I don't like it.
Well, I'll tell you what.
Uppity penguins, I know.
You make some prudent investments, Paul, and you may find yourself right over in Gambia. I mean, you may take the round two, get a shot at it.
What I will say this, I respect the hell out of this guy. Know nothing about his politics necessarily, but I like that he took part himself. He wasn't a backseat coup plotter. This guy he had a rifle. He was storming the palace. I mean, I'll give him that. And I don't know if maybe this is a dated historical thing, but this kind of reminds me of like 1850 style William Walker filibustering. I don't know if anyone is familiar with who William Walker is anymore.
That's Johnny Walker's brother.
Is that for real? Is that legit?
I have no idea.
That can't be right.
Sounds right.
That can't be right. No, William Walker was just an American who spent money that he raised to invade Central American countries to make himself president in the 1850s, and he eventually, was president of Nicaragua for a year in 1859.
Well, that's all it takes.
Different from how people have taken over every country? Is that any different conceptually?
In the broad strokes, no. I mean, it's a little more brazen than say Putin's seizure of Crimea, but in broad brushstrokes, it's basically the same difference.
Mm-hmm.
But really, the question I think that comes out of this, and the biggest question in my mind is, how can we turn this into a delightful romantic comedy? Because this is a plot line like no other. This guy gets out of federal prison for attempting to overthrow the Gambian government, and he's going right to Hollywood.
Yeah, see, but I mean, I don't know. I see this as a comedy.
Yeah,
you know,
Seth Rogen's doing the interview too right now, probably.
The interview.
Yeah,
too?
this would be I think this would be kind of funny. You know, something like a prison movie. You know, like Escape from Alcatraz meets Seth Rogen, stoner.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know.
You know, like Pineapple Express.
I'm picturing it like you remember the old Kirk Douglas movie with I can't remember her name, Romance in the Stone.
Oh,
yeah.
Kind of, yes.
I'm picturing it like Romance in the Stone in the jungles of Gambia, and they get swept up in the this 20-person coup somehow. Guys never show up, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it did end in tragedy though, because I'm pretty sure everybody, with exception to the few folks being prosecuted, I think everyone else died.
Yeah.
So let's talk about coups. Like in Africa, in countries like Gambia, how frequently does power shift by a coup? Is it like all the time?
It's extremely extremely frequently. I mean, I think there's no other way to put it. Especially in certain countries, coups are endemic. I mean, I'm trying to think. There's been a half dozen at least over the last 5 years in countries in Central and Western Africa. There was one in Mali just a couple years ago. There was one in Central African Republic, recently that kicked off the last round of fighting. It's very common, and it's probably less expensive than we thought.
And I'll tell you, so one of the things that I wanted to bring up in this is that this $220K budget included a few $1,000s of spending money for these guys when they got on the ground, and some weapons that they bought that they didn't really need, that they purchased some sniper rifles that were very expensive. So I think when you get down to the cost of the budget that they could have had versus the budget that they used, I think they could have done it a lot cheaper. And,
you know what? Maybe you're right.
They might have cut that in.
You know what? If it were me though, I mean, I go with my weapons.
You can spend the money. You really only get one shot.
Buy the best. Always buy the best. You don't scrimp. I mean, especially if there's a CIA connection to this. Let the CIA foot the bill for the good stuff. You're worth it.
Yeah,
treat yourself. Treat yourself.
There's always a CIA connection.
So this opens the door for though is to sell a prepackaged coup, combo meal where you get your weapons, we'll sell you all the equipment you need to go do your coup, $500,000, and we'll give you a couple of cargo crates. It's got everything in there: your rations, your uniforms, maps. We'll pick out the location for you.
That business definitely already exists, and the CIA already runs it.
It's called Egg Coup Young.
Yeah, and it's aided and abetted by organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID, and basically that kind of operation exists. And all we want to know is, when you're successful in the coup, are you going to give, U.S. transnational companies a better deal on their mining, or other concessions than?
And my argument is, I don't think, and that's a good question, but I think sometimes they don't. A lot of times the CIA-supported folks will take power, and then they will exercise power as they choose to exercise power, which may or may not be in the best interest of the United States. So, the CIA is rolling the dice too. But, that's a government-funded coup package. I mean, is there an opportunity for the free market to sell a coup package?
The CIA and the United States, right? It's kind of like being the Yankees. If one player doesn't work out, you know what? You trade him and you get somebody else. You know what I mean? One dictator doesn't do what you want. Well, coup is obviously not that expensive. So, Mike, you do the math. What is $250,000 as a percentage of U.S. GDP?
Listen, I will tell you that I can sell my house and I can go coup Gambia. I could do that right now if I wanted to put my house on the market.
Go to Costa Rica. Costa Rica has no army. I mean, that seems like a better target.
We're done. When we get off this, the podcast here, we're gonna set this up. Oh, you get to be the Surgeon General of Costa Rica.
I'm in.
So all right. So I want to make one final point on Gambia, and because it's me, I want to make it a serious point.
Okay.
To me, when I was looking at this story, to me what stands out is that, look at Gambia. Here's a country that is a great example of a terrible, terrible dictatorship. I mean, a really repressive country. I mean, their record on how they treat homosexuals is beyond atrocious, right? I mean, persecution, sells short the kind of indiscriminate arrest and torture and imprisonment.
Sure.
Right. So, but nobody. When did Gambia ever get any press? Who'd heard of Gambia? Nobody ever thought about Gambia once. And to me, this just this just makes me, I want to say angry, but kind of.
I'm angry.
You should be angry because no one makes a big deal about Gambia, but the U.S. government can come and pretend that Cuba, for example, or Venezuela are these terrible, brutal dictatorships that are repressing everyone and locking up their citizens. Ignoring the fact that the United States we arrest and incarcerate way more people than either Cuba or Venezuela. But again, it points to the hypocrisy that runs throughout so much of U.S. foreign policy.
I think that
right?
runs in everybody's foreign
to me,
policy.
that stood out about the Gambia.
Yeah. Nick, do you want to talk about the NYPD slowdown?
Yeah. So so here we are. So right in the wake of a lot of the deaths of unarmed black men, obviously, the Michael Browns, the Trayvon Martins, the Eric Garners, especially.
Now, does that count the black men that were killed by other black men, or just the ones that were killed by the police that you're referring to
These
right
are
now?
these are the prominent ones known that were killed by cops.
The ones that got pressed.
And so, right, obviously, there has going back to, again, at least the Trayvon Martin incident. There has been this growing awareness of, the plight of African Americans and how their interactions with police. Especially then. So after Michael Brown, after Eric Garner, after Akai Gurley, Tamir Rice, and so many others, they're obviously developed this large social movement, this large protest movement.
I wouldn't call it large, but it certainly does it gets enough press to be
it's been
mentionable.
It's been in dozens and dozens of cities around the country.
Yeah, but it's organized.
Protested,
So. How do you judge the size? I guess I don't know. There's been larger, I guess, relative. I don't feel that it's very large.
It took the attention of a lot of people, I thought, though, as well. Like, you heard a lot of people, there's a lot of controversy on Facebook about whether people, thought it was right. People were blocking off roads. In Manhattan, people were blocking off business. And also, there were some spin-off protests. Like, for example, there were die-ins at medical schools across the country to protest discrimination against black patients.
Yeah.
I think to say this is widespread is very accurate. This is very widespread. This is a movement, and it has a lot of momentum.
Well, you kind of want everything to be a movement. It's something for sure. I don't know that it's a movement on scale with, more historical civil rights oriented type movements.
Well, okay, but I don't want to necessarily have that conversation.
Yeah, well, I'm not trying to downgrade it. Don't get me wrong. It certainly is something.
Right.
I don't know. I don't want you to overstate how big it is, though.
Well, I would say you're right. Is it a tidal wave? No, but it's a movement. It's a movement. It's a river. It's definitely gaining momentum.
Is it a movement like Occupy Wall Street was a movement?
In response to these killings, there was a social movement, and in response to this movement, there was a police crackdown. Right. In response to that crackdown, there was, further organizing and mobilizing, and eventually this led to the incident in which, someone killed 2 cops in New York. Right. And of course, the fallout from that had triggered a political and labor dispute between the mayor's office, the police commissioner, and the head of the unions in New York. Sure. And eventually, as a labor tactic, the police decided, well, we're just not going to do our jobs as well because that's the kind of, petulant attitude that they always take in labor disputes, seemingly.
So I would tell you, I would think that you would support the police in this. And actually, I think you'd, and so I was thinking about this before we discussed it tonight. I said, I really am curious where Nick is going to fall, because on one hand, you have, an organized labor, almost, bargaining in the collective, against having to police using the broken window policies that put them, that cut against their public image, essentially, and put them at odds with the public, whereas there's a lot of infractions they might normally let go and have the discretion to just say, hey, throw that open container out and get down the road. Whereas, the city of New York is forcing them to follow the broken windows mentality and the broken windows schema of policing, and to cite people for that. And that's on one side, where the police don't want to police like that. They want to have some discretion and be able to exercise that discretion. So there's that, and then on the other side, there's like the police as the power arm of the state and as the jackbooted enforcers. And so, in my mind, I was very curious to see where you would come down on that, because they kind of seem to butt against each other in this case. And so where do you fall here?
The first thing to say is that, I don't see this as an issue of organized labor, because I don't see police as they're not workers, and so their unions are not labor unions in to me the legitimate sense of that word. Labor unions are for they're for workers, they're for proletarians, not the jackbooted thugs of the state.
But that's convenient. Anybody who works for the state is allowed to unionize, and the law recognizes their union,
course,
as they do every other union.
They're allowed to unionize. That's sort of I'm making a kind of a philosophic point about whether or not they should be. I don't think they should, but they legally are.
Right, but the point is that those workers can unionize because there's forces against them, right, that are working. Whereas the police, what's the point? Because they are the force, and no one's,
Well, look, what do you call a group of dudes who act, or women? I don't want to get sexist.
That's sexist.
A group of humans,
group of people
who act in common, who are armed and who are deployed to use violence to enforce a code that they don't choose.
Militia.
A militia, a paramilitary group, a gang, like. That's not a labor union. Like, it's a militia. It's a paramilitary force. So, that's why I would say, no, cops are not workers, and their unions are not unions in the right way. And so that's why I don't support them, even though, again, you're going to find few people who love labor unions as much as I do. Any other profession in which the stakes are as high as police always are talking about them being in their job, so doctors, for example, paramedics. If one of these other groups, as part of a labor dispute with their bosses, decided they were going to do their jobs more slowly or less competently, very few people would still be out touting how professional they were and how they're the best X service in the country or the world. And yet, de Blasio can run around and say, oh, the NYPD is so great, the NYPD is that, and yet here they are, acting basically like petulant children who can't get their way, and you can't have what we want, so we're just gonna work more crappily until you cave in. But to me, right, the great irony is that things are actually going really well in New York while they're sitting it out.
Well,
right, that's the greatest part of this, is that things are actually going really well.
And I see them as a union, a legitimate union, just like many unions, and they are employing the tactics of any given union, where labor has a disagreement with management, and labor exercises, the levers that it can in order to produce the outcome that it wants, and that's what I see here.
Sure. I would say though that, right, if the police union is the house slave of the labor unions, then
right,
it's the most favored one.
Sure.
Because all the while that unions are being attacked, and that is the right verbiage to use. Labor unions are under attack in this country, and it's being made constantly more difficult for them to organize workers in this country. And yet, and even as public sector union workers are under attack, the police never seem to be attacked. The police always seem to be there. They're getting paid, they're getting money. No one's attacking their right to bargain collectively, as other states have been doing with their public sector union workers. Yeah. So it just seems to me that
their quotas now.
I always thought that's absolutely crazy, because it just reeks of policing as a form of taxation and revenue generation, and I feel like that gets away from the traditional model of what the police are supposed to do. You read it on the doors of the cop car, protect and serve, and whatever, however they want to spin it, what have you. I've never liked mandating summonses. You get somebody out there and they're breaking the law, then there's that to deal with. But to mandate summonses is a little ridiculous to me. So in this rare instance, whether the police are unionized or not, I feel like the police response to the mayor was appropriate.
Really?
Yeah, I absolutely do.
Absolutely. Okay. So,
and I'm not even.
I don't want to bring this.
Me. I'm not I'm all about the the police are militarizing and that type of thing, and I do recognize them as a power arm of the state. However, in this case, I understand their need for discretion and their need to treat the folks in their beats and in their neighborhoods that they work in appropriately. If you're sending me.
So what's your take on the police? The funeral protest of them turning their back.
That sends a very strong message. I mean, that's how that is, and you might think it's wrong. However, that's how that game works. It's a political game. I mean, they're playing a political game with the mayor. I mean, that's what that is. So,
I don't know. I just think it's it's a little bit bullshit to me that police organizations could react so vigorously and negatively to athletes. So the St. Louis Rams players come to mind. They've condemned any athletes that have come out to protest police brutality and police violence. Not to protest the police, not to say, hey, let's go murder everyone in a police uniform. They said, hey, we have, which we obviously do, we have this problem of police violence and brutality, and they wanted to call attention to it. And these police unions said it was so inappropriate for these players to protest during a football game, and they're going to do it during a funeral. I mean, the latter seems a lot more tactless.
No, I'd agree, and I'd agree with you because everybody's playing the politics of this up, and I don't think anybody is spared the political dimension of this discussion. But the real McCoy here is that as a police officer on a beat, you put me in the middle of a low income area, and people are just hostile to the police to begin with. The police have a bad rep in that neighborhood, and you put somebody in there and you make them walk around, and instead of letting them befriend the folks that they're trying to work with and interact to build a strong community, you're requiring them to hand out citations for bullshit. And those people are like, man, this is ridiculous.
Yeah,
and so that just furthers those tensions. So in this case, if I'm the police officer on the street, and now not only am I the target of negative public perception, but somebody may come and put a bullet in my head for something that happened in another state, and because you're forcing me to hand out low-level citations for what we all know is bullshit, hell no. I'm not putting my life on the line so that the mayor can get his crime stats up and look good. Now,
isn't it sad though that it took getting 2 police officers killed in this way for anyone to be able to stand up and say, this is a terrible way to do policing, that we are antagonizing disenfranchised communities of color, we are disproportionately targeting and punishing one group of people, for crimes committed at, basically equal rates across demographic groups.
Well, and I'm not going to speak to the rates because I don't have them in front of me, but what I can say is I think people have been speaking up on those topics for a long time, and I think what you're referring to is how it's made its way into the mainstream press, which, that's a whole nother issue, that, the lack of news coverage for some things which ought to be on the news and ought to be important and aren't, because we have to watch the Golden Globes and we have to watch E! Entertainment and know who's marrying who.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I think it's sad that it took an insane, in a way, kind of series of tragedies, again, going back to Trayvon Martin through, the now seemingly endless series. Every day it's a new, case of someone being killed by the police, right?
Well, yeah.
And until all these dominoes fell, no one started looking and looking back and starting to investigate this larger pattern that is, again, decades and decades old of police brutality and police violence against communities of color.
I think that at the very least, if there was a silver lining to this whole thing, it's that it has fostered discussion and people are talking about it with their neighbors and their community, and people are taking a hard look at it. And I'll tell you who I think the real victim is here is the hundreds and hundreds of black men who have been killed by other black men in their communities who aren't getting any press, and they aren't getting on the news because it wasn't killed by a cop. And these are cousins, brothers, neighbors, friends. So where's the attention on that spotlight? Because if you stack up the number of killings by cop to the number of killings by folks in their own community, in the black community, and in low-income areas, the number's below the death by cop away. And I think we do a disservice to those folks by brushing over those for the very sexy narrative of the cop, shooting low-income folks out in this area.
Well, I mean, in a way, you're right. In a way, I think we certainly can, and we definitely do overlook the victims of, what we have come to all too glibly refer to as routine gun violence in places like Chicago.
Yeah, right. Routine, right?
We do get a kind of numb to them. But to the larger point, though, I think when people bring up this issue of black on black violence or black on black crime in this context, it's often largely a canard. It's often largely I think a distraction from.
I don't agree with that.
The issue of the issue that's at hand, and that's the legitimate, gutting crisis is a good word, of police brutality and police violence against communities and persons of color.
I'm not going to agree that it
stems from their their impunity.
And I'm not going to agree that it's a canard. Both are legitimate issues in my mind, though one more so than the other. But speaking of police, have either of you guys ever heard of Jimmy Justice?
Yes. Well, I hadn't until you brought it up for this week, so I looked him up.
Okay, so Jimmy Justice is not a new guy. He's been around for quite a while, and I've been a fan of his for quite a while. One of the things he does is he is very much about holding the police accountable for their behavior. Okay, and so how does Jimmy Justice do that? He carries around a video camera in New York City, various locations, and he will find, officers of the law who are doing something illegal, and he will record them. He'll get their badge number, and he'll do that kind of thing, and then he makes it public. And there's some embarrassment there. There's a lot of stuff. But what I find interesting about that is when some of these folks are held to account, they respond very violently. So here, and I queued up a clip here. I'm going to play it. It's only about 20 seconds long, so you can get a taste of it. And let me set this up here. This Jimmy Justice has come upon this car that is parked in front of a fire hydrant. Now there was nobody in the car, and then this guy came out of the shop. He was in a commercial establishment doing some shopping with a woman who is implied to be his wife. I mean, it's a female companion, and they get in this car that's parked in front of the fire hydrant, and Jimmy Justice. No, it's not a cop car. It's a regular, a personally owned vehicle. In the dashboard of the car is basically a pass that allows the officer to park when he's on duty wherever he needs to park and to not be cited or towed or anything like that. It basically allows him to park somewhere that he may not be able to park legally, but it's for official purposes only to facilitate whatever he's doing on duty. So let me play the rest of this.
He's got to catch a purse snatcher.
Yeah, well, yeah.
What are you doing? What are you doing? You can't touch me. Why? I can do whatever I want. That's a man funny. Why are you allowed to touch me? I touch you? What did I touch you? What man funny? You mentioned me. Do you normally block fire hydrants and misuse your official police department placard when you go shopping with your family, officer? That's a CD, buddy. That's a CD.
And what it says on the screen is that CD is a command discipline, and it's worse than a parking summons. So Jimmy Justice will take all these tapes and these recordings of these officers and turn them into the police department so that the officers can be disciplined. And so he's he's got a following. This video that I'm looking at right now has 315,000 views on YouTube, and this is just one of the many he puts up. And this guy is almost he's almost a vigilante of sorts, except his vigilanteism is against, it's kind of to keep the power of the state in check, and it's at the smallest level possible. He's not out there protesting very large things. He's individual with the officers, on the spot. So So I was interested to know what you guys thought about this.
So what do the police departments do when they get the videos? Do they like put them through the shredder, or do they actually take them seriously?
I don't know. I've never heard any follow up on it. That's a good question. And you would think they would. I mean, the evidence is right in front of them. But if they don't, it just speaks to some immeasurable amount of corruption.
Certainly, we've seen over the summer that evidence does not, get you off the hook, or rather, indict someone for murder.
Yeah.
Well, sort of what I find interesting is that this guy is even still allowed to do this because obviously, piggyback on what you were saying, Paul. In the wake of Eric Garner, obviously, where the video evidence was not enough of to get an indictment, a lot of places started passing laws actually criminalizing the filming of police. So, in response to some good Samaritan citizen, and getting on tape this, and recording this brutal incident of police abuse, our democratic institutions in many places respond not by, increasing transparency of the police. They criminalize documenting police brutality, right? And
you say democratic institutions, right? And that's the
quote,
key
scare quotes
here.
there, exactly.
Right, exactly. Because who is actually going to vote for that? If you go around and ask people, would you want to hold your police accountable for their actions? No one's going to say no.
Well, what I find interesting is that they will, on the job, be more worried about transparency. They will take a video camera, put it on an officer. They want those records to be, able to be requested and by the general public. And
we've unfortunately already seen, just in the past couple of months, a handful of cases already where officers were involved in shootings and their cameras weren't on, or they malfunctioned, or they didn't have it that day for
they will put the cameras
reason.
On the officer during the officer's on duty time, but there is no effort during the off duty time to excuse the pun, to police their behavior.
Yeah, especially the behavior of the NYPD, which according to black members of the NYPD includes harassing black people like themselves, even after finding out that they're fellow cops.
I don't buy that the NYPD harasses any more so than anybody else. And if they do, I wonder how much of it is driven by City Hall, making them harass and cite people, stop and frisk.
However it compares to other places, it's all too much, right? I mean, it's all got to go. It all has to stop.
Well, to single out the NYPD though is probably. I mean, is there any kind of statistics out there that show they do it more than the LAPD, for instance?
What was it, Calgary a couple of years ago?
Yes.
There were riots at Calgary after I think a Stanley Cup playoff or a Stanley Cup game, and basically the people went around burning cars, cop cars, and creating mayhem. And the cops kind of stood around and they just let the people do what they were going to do. They didn't really. If this were the NYPD, they'd be cracking people's skulls, they'd be tasing people, they'd be chokeholding people, Yeah. And other countries as well, not just Canada, and I would assume also in some U.S. cities, probably like Portland, Oregon.
I mean, I don't know the stats right on top of my head, but I mean,
I don't think we should speak to it without the stats, though, because we're just speculating.
That, the NYPD has a perception, along with Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, of being L.A., of being a tough police department, of being one of the more aggressive, more brutal departments. But you're right. We can't establish anything about that here without some good stats.
So I thought Jimmy Justice was interesting, and I thought he was a good dovetail to the discussion on the NYPD slowdown, because he's not intimately involved, but he's on the other side of the law there. At least somebody in a vigilante capacity. One of the things that I wanted to talk about tonight was the oil war with Russia. Nick, I'm going to let you set that up because you probably need to do some explaining for the folks that aren't really following what is going on.
Perfect, thank you. Right, so
what is oil?
Yeah, what is war?
Are you talking about
Russia?
oil?
All tucked away down there. Right. So this is. I want to talk about this particularly because I think this is one way. The United States goes to war without people even realizing that we're at war. And I know, there's the kind of, the other 1% movement out there, that less than 1% of Americans, right, fought in Iraq and Afghanistan and are actually in the military. And so, Americans, we don't have this sense of how our country goes to war and in what ways we do it. And so this is, I think, a great example of a way that we wage economic war. So here's the stage setting, and I'll do this like really briefly, and I'm gonna gloss over a lot of the details for, simplicity's sake. Right. So basically, right, Ukraine has a revolution, a coup, if you will. Their president declines to sign a trade agreement with the European Union in favor of joining one with Russia, right? This made everyone unhappy, and there was, again, a revolution or a coup from a different point of view. In the wake of this, right, a new government is installed. After the new government is installed in Kiev, Russia invades and annexes Crimea. In response to this sort of threatening action by Russia, the Ukrainians in Kiev get closer to the EU. This further kind of upsets Russia, who sees Ukraine as kind of part of its natural patrimony, the city of Kiev especially. And so basically Russia encourages and foments this nationalist separatist movement in the east of the country in the region called the Donbass. And this is sort of from their point of view, this is an anti-coup, anti-fascist, separatist movement that they have going on in eastern Ukraine.
Yeah, so get to the oil war.
Exactly. And so civil war basically ensues. The West tries to make peace, right? Nothing works. The fighting continues, right? In the midst of all this, you have you have that MH17 incident, right? So tensions are high, right? You have part of this calculation, right, is the encroachment of NATO and the EU on, Russia's borders, which, right, is a, kind of almost 19th century kind of geopolitical fault. And so basically it's in this mix that basically the United States decided to impose some sanctions on Russia to try to hurt them economically. They did some. The EU went along with some of them, but not as vigorous as the U.S. ones. This played out for a few months, and it wasn't hurting Russia as much. And so they tried to expand the sanctions a little more, get more people in. It really didn't have the effect they were looking for. And so eventually what they decided to do was, in many ways, a replay of the same strategy that allowed the United States to win the Cold War. And very few people in America know how the Cold War was actually won.
Well, very few people
and it was actually
agree
won by
with what
the
you're
United
about
States
to
and
say.
Saudi Arabia.
I was going to say Reagan.
Yeah, Reagan did not do it. It was the United States and Saudi Arabia. With their help, we tanked the price of oil and ruined the Russian economy, just like we're trying to do today.
Yeah. Well, but the shoe is almost on the other foot today, with the profligate spending going on that the USSR was doing at the time that the Saudis boosted the production. What was that? 1985. The Soviets couldn't keep up. Their economy was stretched to the limit. And that's one of the reasons one of the many reasons, that it hit the economy very hard, and it helped to tank and destroy the Soviet Union. But if you look at the American economy now, it's almost like we're in that boat.
Yeah. Well, so here to me, let's not get into why did the Soviet Union collapse kind of discussion. To me, what the interesting part of this is, right, as we're tanking the oil price, as we're continuing these other banking and economic sanctions, right, what did Russia do? Well, Russia signed some big-time trade deals with China.
Of course.
And what to me is significant about these is that, at least from China's point of view and from the U.S.'s point of view, these were trade deals that involved trade basically denominated in China's currency, right? This is China taking, you can call it maybe a baby step, but I think it's more than that. In establishing the place or increasing the place of the yuan in, international, transactions.
Yeah.
So what I think is sort of interesting is that, as we're trying to cut Russia off, we might actually inadvertently heal the kind of Sino-Soviet split and push Russia and China sort of closer together, and basically, increase the prominence of the yuan as a reserve currency, right? I mean,
Russia's made no secret about knocking the United States down off its reserve currency pedestal. I mean, that has been one of the goals, and I think that, in their opinion, the United States exercises a lot of influence by its status as the global reserve currency. So,
it undoubtedly does.
I mean,
that's
you're trying to shorten that sword. If you're the Russians, you want to shorten that sword and reduce that influence, and relatively increase your own influence.
Sure. I think the Russians would love to see the ruble rise and not the yuan, but at this point, with their backs to the wall, right, they'll take whatever they can get, right? Anything to kind of put a finger in the eye of the U.S.
Yeah, and I mean the Saudi pricing at the reduced level. They had some prints on some interview the other day, and he was talking about, we're not doing this on purpose to put our thumb in the eye of the Russians. It's hurting us too, but in my mind, that's the compensation.
I think that's total bullshit.
Yeah.
The Saudis want to hurt the Russians because the Russians are backing Assad.
That's right.
The U.S. loves it because you tank the oil price and you cripple places like Russia and places like Venezuela, which is not an insignificant benefit from our end, because we've been manufacturing this crisis in Venezuela for, we've been tending it like a bonsai plant for like a good 2 years now since Hugo Chavez died, and we finally worked them up to the point where, if we can keep the oil price low like this, we think we could push them over the edge too.
And the big conspiracy theory is that the Saudis have an interest in Syria because they want to promote a pipeline from Qatar to Turkey that will then hook up into a Turkish pipeline, whose name is escaping me right now, that will then run west to Europe and take Gazprom out of the equation.
Wow. Hey,
I did not know that.
That doesn't surprise me in the least. I mean,
when you hear it sounds like one of those, if it's a conspiracy theory, you're like, well, maybe it's true. I mean, it sounds like it could be true. Well, it certainly sounds like something somebody would do.
I believe, for the record, I believe every conspiracy theory that has ever existed. It's just easier that way. It's easier that way.
That's the unfortunate thing, is that, life is always going to be stranger than fiction. And the things that go on in the worlds of what I would call the ruling class, the elite, they are as diabolical as they seem sometimes. And it is a game of exclusion and of cutting someone out of the business. It's ruthless. I mean, to me, that's that's international capitalism.
Put in some very sinister music during this part.
Yes, dub in some.
Just like I don't know, something from
Wagner, or like something with a Vincent Price saying something.
Well, I guess it's but on the flip side, it's better than killing 50 million people in the name of central planning.
Well,
cue the villainous music.
Yes.
Well, I'm not, again, I don't want to get into a discussion of the relative merits of 5-year plans and centralized production.
If only they had faster computers, it would have all been okay.
Yeah, I mean, in a way that you could say that's right.
They just had the internet with tubes.
I mean, there are a great many reasons why the Soviet regime was the way it was, why it didn't last longer than it did, and none of them have to have anything to do with sort of the essential viability of a planned economy or a more organized system of economic production. And there's a lot of good research that suggests, right, the Soviet economy was as efficient or only slightly less so than the American capitalist economies, throughout their lifetime.
Mike makes right, though, so we just talked about what happened. Hey, have you guys been following this Charlie Hebdo thing?
Yeah, I definitely have been.
How about you, Paul, yeah?
Yeah, I have, on the Twitter a little bit. On
the old Twitters?
I'm all the Twitters.
Are you following Gorilla Roundtable yet? Follow Gorilla Roundtable.
I've heard of the show.
Have I plugged our? Do you think I've plugged us enough yet?
I think that's good.
Twitter.
Yeah, the first listener who gets a Gorilla Roundtable tattoo can listen for free for the rest of their life. So we're all familiar with what happened at Charlie Hebdo and the shooting and all that, and I don't want to concentrate on that because I feel like that speaks for itself in its wrongness. But what I wanted to talk about that I thought interesting about the entire thing was the chilling effect that the Charlie Hebdo, I'm going to call it the Charlie Hebdo shootings, had on American newspapers. I guess some British newspapers too, the Telegraph, New York Daily News, New York Times, even CNN, which obviously is not a newspaper, but They decided not to show the cartoons that Charlie Hebdo had run that caused, I guess, that were the impetus for some of these shootings, even though we know it probably stretches back a lot further. But the images in question, they would not show on the news or portray in the newspaper. So I thought that was very interesting because this is, a different setup here. And it made me wonder, are these newspapers, a lot of them, when questioned about that, they say, well, we have a policy not to try to incite violence, and we decided not to run because we have policies against. And I found myself wondering if that was that their out, or is that their real policy? Do we as a free society have a right to look at those? Do we have an expectation that the newspaper is going to run controversial images, as a free press? Which, I can put that in scare quotes.
Can go online and find them, but so yeah, I mean,
should you have to,
Yeah, given that event, I think there's repercussions for those editors to run those photos as they are. I mean, just the gravity of the event was too high. It was kind of like the if we go back to 9/11, the jumper photo. You remember that?
Yeah.
Like it was so controversial, and then finally when one news outlet did get the courage to run with it, many others followed suit with that same picture. But yeah, in a similar, it's like this iconic photograph that becomes this too taboo because of just really the violation that it represents.
Yeah, it makes you wonder though if free speech is necessary for a free society to function. And free speech in the large sense, not in the legal sense, but in the idealistic sense. If it's necessary for a free society to function, where do you draw the line on that? And obviously, newspapers self-censor, but are they self-censoring because they didn't want to offend, or are they self-censoring out of a notion of self-preservation?
Boy, I mean, right? It's a little from column A, it's a little from column B. It's always a mix. Part of me thinks that free speech is a wonderful thing, but so is discretion, so is tact, so is respect, and I think we are, for better or worse, and I guess I think for better. We're living in multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-religious societies now, and I think that means being sensitive to things like Muslims don't like. You're not supposed to, show images of the prophet. And I think
I got a question for you. And I get what you're saying. I have a question for you. The Michael Brown image where he's laying on the street, shot up, and there's a pool of blood coming out from him. Was that right to show on the news? Because you could make the same argument that it's going to stir up protests and violence, and it did. I mean, we talked about that earlier in the show.
I mean, I don't have necessarily a problem with images of violence. Per se. I mean, to me, that's just reality.
Well, not an image of violence, but a provocative image. It's a showing of a provocative image. Just,
I know. I'm not against all provocative images. I'm not. Do I think that, like, the kind of people who would, who would react so violently to a cartoon, right? I mean, I get why Muslims would be offended by it, and I get why they don't look at it, and I get why they would, encourage you, hey, please don't, in the future, don't do that. It's really offensive to us, But I would agree. It's a step too far to kill someone about it, right? I just think it's a step too far to go and assassinate abortion doctors. But
these newspapers,
that doesn't get as much press in this country as
the newspapers who have hid behind their policies.
Times a Muslim person does anything violent.
So the newspapers who have hid behind their quote unquote policies of not displaying and glamorizing these provocative images. That's been their go-to line against why they didn't show these images of Muhammad. But I would bet you 9 out of 10 of them ran these photos of Old Boy in New York City, and then again of Michael Brown, and then probably of other things that are equally provocative, but would incite violence and anguish in other communities, not necessarily the Muslim community. So, it makes me wonder why are the newspapers and why is the media, and not at large, but these particular newspapers and these particular media outlets, why are they sensitive to the Muslim community in a way that they're not sensitive to the black community?
A fair point. Well, I guess what worries me a lot in the wake of the whole Charlie Hebdo incident is, just a continual rise in Islamophobia, and with these seemingly deep transatlantic connections. Every time there's a terror attack, on either side, it seems to be fed into the kind of propaganda machine of the other side as further reinforcement of the need for this ever-expanding military, industrial, police, intelligence, security complex.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody likes that on the right or the left. I think the only people really benefiting from that are some folks in a globalist fashion.
Yeah, Lockheed Martin, Grumman, or Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, the companies who make the smart bombs and the Kevlar vests and
so if you want
all those lovely depleted uranium shells that we fire.
So if you wanted to buy a copy of the issue of Charlie Hebdo that had that picture, how much would you pay for it?
I bet what I understand, there were 3 million issues.
I don't care.
There were 3 million issues, and they were all sold out. Is that what you heard as well, Paul?
Yeah, they sold out like 3,000. I mean, I'm sure if you went to eBay, I wonder what you would buy it for on eBay.
$117,000. $117,839. This is after the initial 3 million sold out.
I don't believe that because I can't imagine that the amount of money that generated is 3 million times 117,000. Every one of those papers could sell for 117,000.
No, not every one of those. That's like as much as. So this was after the first 3 million. So then after that, then the most that people paid for an issue seems to be 117,839.
Crazy. Well, and I don't know if that's the effect that the terrorists wanted, but this is certainly the effect that they got. So I know that, Nick, you have recently been reading Salt.
Yes. Oh, my God.
So why don't you tell us a little about that, because I've heard it's a phenomenal book.
It is a fantastic book.
Salty.
So the name of the book is Salt, A World History. It's by a guy named Mark Kurlansky, whose previous book was about cod, so the fish, which I like.
Codfish.
I am so salty,
yeah.
Which we'll talk about. So I'm psyched to read his book about fish now. But what I found so interesting about this book, Salt, was that this guy does a great job of presenting the sort of cultural and culinary and political economic history of salt in this several thousand-year narrative, and to do it in a very highly entertaining and highly enlightening way, to show the different ways that ancient cultures used salt and thought about salt, basically how its scarcity made it a strategic resource for millennia, and that really it's only in the last, say, couple hundred years that sort of modern geology and modern science have proved how ubiquitous salt is, and so when you don't think about the essential nature of salt and salt production in sort of the rise of empires and in the sort of strategic thinking of political and economic calculation over the centuries. And so it was an immensely fascinating book about a commodity that I think we all really take very for granted.
Let me tell you something about salt. If you didn't have salt, you would die.
You literally would die. Salt makes you live.
Having gone to school in upstate New York, I have to say that the portion of the book devoted to the salt industry in upstate New York was extremely interesting. The development of the Erie Canal as a canal to move salt, essentially.
To move salt.
Some other things. Yeah. That's stuff that, growing up in New York, I never knew that. And even growing up in that region, I never heard that. I didn't hear that until somebody I know read the book and told me. So I feel like that book is full of facts like that are super interesting.
Yes, super, things that you don't even think about, like the word salary is derived from the word salt, or from the word meaning salt, because the Roman soldiers would often be paid in salt, right? I mean, this is one of the first commodities to be treated in many ways, I think, in the very Marxian sense, as a commodity,
right?
So again, I guess from that point of view, I found it, supremely fascinating, and especially about things like how, the need for fuel to heat the fires that were underneath the evaporating pans, right? How this helped contribute to deforestation.
Isn't that always the case though, that the ancillary technologies around any given commodity they have such far-reaching consequences? They spawn technologies of their own, which then branch off and become their own line of technology. I find that to be extremely interesting as well.
Yeah. Oh my. I mean, and so in the part of the book that he talks about, the discovery of the cod fish, which apparently, was this fish that, you could just, apparently it reacted so well to the salting.
Oh yeah.
That it stayed better and longer, which meant you could transport it farther and longer. And eventually it led to this huge, economic boom. And again, arguably, as the book kind of suggests, one of the drivers of, European ocean-going exploration and discovery in the early modern period was attributed to whaling and cod fishing.
Yeah.
That the ability to salt and preserve your catch meant you could sail out farther, get a larger catch before having to come back, and sell it. And so, one of the things that helped spawn this, this quote age of discovery, was
salt.
This sort of, it was salt, that, the way that salt interacted with a growing market in Europe for fish, because of course there were many fast days, as they were called, that basically you couldn't eat certain kinds of meat.
Salt is actually sodium chloride, and sodium chloride, as you know, is an electrolyte, which is so important for how the brain works. So I think most of you probably know that. Salt's obviously not only important for the brain, but also for muscles and how they fire. But as an electrolyte, basically salt, in the form of sodium chloride, allows ion movement across cell membranes, which basically provides a battery for your cells to communicate with each other, and in order to fire what's called action potentials.
So let me ask you a question about that, Paul. So one of the things that I've always done when I've gone hiking is take a little pinch of table salt and drop it into my hiking bottle when I fill it with water.
Yeah, it's a good plan.
And I've always felt like that somehow is more refreshing than when I just take regular water with no little bit of salt in it. So is it making a difference, or is it all in my mind?
No, it's definitely making a difference, because what happens is, in order to maintain the osmolarity, it's called, of your body, what has to happen is that when you sweat, to cool yourself down, you have to release salt. Because otherwise, you have an excess of salt in your body. You have to excrete the salt along with the water, and so therefore you have to take in the salt to replenish that's lost as an electrolyte. So what can happen, you can actually die if you just drink pure water continuously without replenishing the electrolytes.
That happens to people who take, some people take drugs and end up drinking a lot of water because they feel like they're overheating. And they basically dilute their vitamins and their salt. Is that right? And then they end up with a very negative health outcome? Right.
Yeah, you can't dilute it. And I mean, on the other end of the spectrum, you have, drinks that are super sugary like Powerade, Gatorade. And sure, those are great if you're like really sick and throwing up and stuff, and you really need to replenish not only your electrolytes, but in general, yeah, when you go hiking, putting a pinch of salt in your bottle is going to really help out so that you can replenish those electrolytes, so your nerve cells and your muscle cells keep firing normally.
It's what
because
plants
otherwise
crave.
Your muscles shut down, your brain shuts down, and you shut down.
Yep, shut it down.
Shutting it down. But let me tell you what doesn't shut it down: dopamine. So I
tell me about dopamine, man. Is dopamine the? I'll let you explain dopamine. Then I got a question for you.
All right. So dopamine it's a neurotransmitter, which means that it's a chemical in the brain that flows between neurons and allows for those neurons to communicate with each other in a very specific way. And so, what's interesting about dopamine is that although everyone kind of knows it as a buzzword right now, particularly involving addiction and drugs, about 40, 50 years ago, people didn't actually think that dopamine was a neurotransmitter. But there was another related neurotransmitter called norepinephrine or noradrenaline that everyone thought was kind of the really important one. And then they discovered that dopamine was actually doing quite a bit more. And so there's three things that dopamine is important for cognition, for our ability to think, for movement, and also for our ability to seek out rewards. So
is
if you
dopamine
like something,
the chemical that is released when someone takes cocaine?
Right.
So
it's released. But what people don't know, actually, and what's really interesting is that if you keep giving someone cocaine, it's not the first time they get cocaine, dopamine gets released in the brain, right? Just like you'd expect. But after that, dopamine doesn't get released right when you take the cocaine. So what dopamine actually is it's a signal for prediction of reward or prediction of things that feel good. So it doesn't actually correspond to the good feeling. It's really like your brain saying, okay, I got something that was good, and so dopamine is going to tell me it's a switch that says, yeah, seek that out. And on the flip side, say that I expected to get cocaine, but then I didn't get it, and I'd be disappointed. And in that disappointment, what that actually refers to is a reduction in dopamine. So when you feel disappointed, it's because your dopamine has gone down.
That's interesting. I heard it was almost an analogy that involved a sink, a faucet, a sink, and a drain. And I want to say it referred to dopamine, and I may be showing my ignorance of brain chemicals here, but it basically talked about the different drugs and it basically drew an analogy between, a faucet flooding a sink and then stopping up the drain and I don't know. Yeah. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. So basically it deals with how the drugs work on dopamine. So picture the sink as the synapse, and the synapse is the space between your neurons, right? So what happens is you turn on the faucet in a normal situation, right? Something makes you feel good, or there's an expectation reward. Dopamine gets released, right? And so it's the faucet gets turned on, it's filling up the sink, right? But usually you have a drain in place, and what that drain is what's called dopamine transporters. And these things are needed in order to what's called reuptake, or take dopamine back up into the cell so that it's not continuously functioning. Because the thing that neurotransmitters need is the ability to not only be released, but also to stop the release precisely. Now, that being said, what drugs like cocaine and methamphetamine, what these types of drugs do is, and speed, Ritalin, all these types of drugs, they block those transporters. So they're like the plug on the drain, the bung, if you will. And so they block that drain. Yeah. There's a bung factory down Nick Street, and I think it's the most hilarious thing. Anyways, those drugs will provide that block for that drain, and so the dopamine just fills up in the sink, and you have too much of it. And so essentially what happens in the end is the body gets used to that and then produces less dopamine. So if you don't have the drug, you feel awful. You feel disappointed all the time, and that's why you go through withdrawal, get addicted.
That's crazy, man. Very, very crazy. I mean, everybody knows somebody who suffers from that.
Do you know how much addiction costs the U.S. economy?
I bet you it's a fortune.
$500 billion.
That's a big number.
Brilliant.
$500 billion if you tabulate it for everything that, mostly drug addiction, but I think it also includes nicotine that leads to cancer, which is a big one. Nicotine and alcohol addiction.
We throw away in food, in wasted food, about $250 billion.
If there was only a...
Or no, it's $250 billion.
If there was only a 0.02% tax on labor union dues, we could redirect that money to help addiction.
Yeah, that would be great.
Let's tax workers instead of millionaires and stock market robber barons.
All right, guys. We appreciate you tonight. This has been Gorilla Roundtable with Mike, Nick, and Paul.
Hey, let's not forget to remind everyone to follow us on Twitter and check out our YouTube page and subscribe there to follow all the further episodes of The Gang here at Gorilla Roundtable.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Thanks, Mike.
Hey, good night, guys. We will see you next week, folks.